Thank you everyone to be here and welcome. This is my final general meeting as the president of Oral History Victoria, so I just want to open this event thanking everyone for the past 3 years, which have been wonderful, and first of all Al for involving me initially in this adventure. I think we have had a very strange but somehow wonderful year as an association. We have achieved so much and improved all the systems of the organization and created events that were very well attended. So I think overall we have had a great year. So I will not spend more time on this because I'm quite excited to let Al introduce our guest, and so I'll pass the word to Al.
Lovely, thanks Francesco. Can I just suggest, if you haven't already, just unless you're going to be speaking, if you could just mute your audio. I think most people have. So yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce this section about the Oral History Awards. Since Oral History Victoria has been running an annual award since 2015, and if you look at the website, you'll see some wonderful projects and products that have been shortlisted and commended for the award over the last half a dozen years. This year, for the first time, we teamed up with the Victorian Community History Awards, who last year for the first time had an Oral History Award. And so we've done it jointly. So it's a joint affair with Oral History Victoria, the Public Record Office of Victoria, and the Royal Historical Society of Victoria. I want to thank my fellow judges, Alicia Tioretto and Elizabeth Triaraco, who are both here. We had a lot of fun watching and reading all of the nominations and making the difficult decision about the 3 that we shortlisted, all of which we really enjoyed. What we're going to do, it's very simple. We're going to ask each of the 3 different projects to, in turn, just talk for about 10 minutes about their project, share some of their experiences of it with you, and then we'll have about 5 minutes of Q&A after each one. And then at the end, I'll let you know the final result, which actually was announced in a video yesterday, but not all of you will know. So let's start, and without further ado, I'd just like to introduce Dot Griffin and Jan Shaw, Ruth South and Arthur Wintle from the Cockatoo History and Heritage Group, who were shortlisted for their wonderful book, which I can hold up here, Cockatoo, Voices from the Past. Now, I believe that Ruth is going to share her screen, which you can start doing now, and Dot is going to speak to the project.
Good evening, and thank you for inviting Cockatoo History and Heritage Group to talk about our book, Cockatoo, Voices from the Past. We're going to share the story of how our book finally became a publication. When I first moved into Cockatoo, there was a local newsletter in circulation that had a history section. I got the bug and became interested in Cockatoo's history. At the time, Cockatoo was in the process of changing its image with an influx of young families. New homes were being built, old houses done up. A new kindergarten, replacement tennis courts, netball courts, bowls club, new community hall. Change was on the way. 16th of February 1983 saw the Ash Wednesday fires, which devastated Cockatoo and Upper Beaconsfield. Whilst we lost minimum community buildings, we lost 307 houses, 6 lives, and the fires burnt out 18 square kilometres of our terrain. Our town had changed. When I heard our community hall, which is what you can see there, had burnt down with photos on the wall, and that one of the rooms had lots of our history in it, hall minutes, boxes with bits and pieces, photos, I realised that we not only lost so many houses and people's lives changed, but we'd also lost decades of history. Many residents left the area immediately after the fires, and with them went their history and photos. Aileen Campbell was the wife of our chemist in Cockatoo, and she received a letter from an ex-resident, Myrtle Grayson. Aileen knew I was interested in our history, and she gave me the letter and said, "You should contact this lady." Visiting Myrtle started me on the way to interviewing about 20 people over a 20-year period, collecting photos, letters, and anything I could find on Cockatoo. I had a young family and already involved in my community, worked part-time, and my husband Colin and I were starting to build our own home. So I fitted in interviews around kinder, school, scout drop-offs, and pickups and work. I had no experience and no knowledge of Cockatoo's history except from the Cockatoo newsletters, and would visit each person several times using an old tape recorder. And as a young mum, we had no spare money, so I taped over top of a lot of old tapes. I tried to transcribe a couple of tapes and found with continual stopping and starting of the player, the tapes were stretching, and before I finished, I would have destroyed them. So I put them in a box and packed them away, as I just didn't know how to transcribe them. One of our locals offered to transcribe Bob Porter's interview. I never saw the tape again. That was the last time I let the tapes out of my sight. In 2011, I met Arthur Wintle, a retired teacher who had grown up in the district. We got talking about his too valuable to leave and warranted transcription and to be available for Cockatoo's history. In 2012, Arthur applied for a local history grant from the Public Record Office of Victoria. The overall purpose of the local history grant was to preserve and share Cockatoo's history. The grant allowed us to hire someone to transcribe the tapes, buy archival quality folders and sleeves to protect our growing photographic collection. Arthur bought a digitalising machine at his own expense and digitalised the tapes. We were going to print 20 copies of the final transcription. Arthur has a passion for history, a former history teacher, the editor of our book, and a fantastic researcher. In July 2012, Colin was transferred overseas for 3 months, which became a 6-year project. So off we headed for Leeds in the UK. Arthur had met Ruth South while fighting to save the old Cockatoo Kinder in 2011. Ruth is a keen photographer, so Arthur asked her to attend a Victorian collection workshop. Ruth came home and uploaded many of Cockatoo's photos and items onto the site. Ruth then started a Facebook page, the Cockatoo History and Heritage Group, which now has over 1,400 members. This opened up a vast collection of photos to choose from for our book. Ruth is the curator of photos in our group and is skilled in photography software, enhancing and sharpening poor quality images. Ruth performs miracles. Jan is a local passionate historian who has an amazing ability to find records and put together information. In 2012, I asked Jan if she would help me with a one-off project, archiving from local newspapers. Jan thought a 6 months project. She often laughs that it turned into a book and 7 years of hard labour and lots of laughs. Jan is our go-to lady for formatting, layouts, corrections and gathering of information. A capable secretary, brilliant researcher, and was able to track many of the relatives of the original interviewees to be able to put together their histories. Our transcriber found the tapes were hard to understand and it took many hours to type up each tape. We had to make the decision to finish transcribing the tapes ourselves. And as I'd done the original interviews, I was the person to take over the jobs. I came home to Australia for a holiday and took back to South Africa several of the tapes and a wonderful machine that made it much easier to transcribe them. It was amazing. As I listened to the tapes, I was transported back to the interviews. I could recall the smells, what type of day it was, and the feel of the interviews. Hear our 4-year-old daughter Naomi in the background, opening up her snacks and whispering, "How much longer, Mummy?" Naomi is now in her 40s. We spent 4 years transcribing the tapes as they had originally been recorded as questions and answers. Life was hectic for us all, and we asked Prov for several extensions as some of us had health issues and I was away overseas for most of the time. As we got to the last of the interviews, everyone was getting excited and we were all looking forward to finishing the project when the thought of turning it into a book started to take hold. No, not in the format it was currently in. We were about to start all over again. 2016 to 2019, we had to work out style, etc. And I got the job of changing the question and answer format to stories. Arthur was very explicit in that the people had to still use their own words. Some stories are almost verbatim, but to improve readability, others had to be shortened and rearranged under subheadings, and some obscure passages have been summarised or deleted. Whilst I was working on the stories, Jan and Arthur were doing research on the original people I had interviewed and tried to check that the information was correct. We work as a well-oiled team, even though we set several deadlines and missed them all. We met every Tuesday last year at Jan's for lots of hard work and gluten-free coconut macaroons, our favourite. Another criteria was that our book had to be affordable and available locally. To date, for a very small group who thought that only a few people would want to read our book, we have sold over 270 books. We knew we wanted to launch our book within our own community. So at Cockatoo's annual, we launched our book. Now time to relax. Jen believed that our book should be entered in the oral history section of the Public Records Office Communities History Awards, which are held in conjunction with the Royal Historical Society of Victoria. Imagine our excitement when we were told that our book had been shortlisted. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Dot. And thanks, Ruth, for sharing the photos, and for all of you in that extraordinary team. So we've got about 5 minutes for any questions that any of you have got. You can just raise your hand, and if I can see you on the screen, or you can send it through the chat if you want. Would anybody like to ask any questions or make any comments to Dot and her team about the Cockatoo History Project? Alicia.
Oh, I just wanted to say that I loved how you presented that. And I think reading your book, you can see your love for the people and how important it was to share those voices. And I love to see the way that you presented it to us tonight was the same. You really sort of celebrated the people who were involved. And it just, to me, it just showed it was a real labour of love for you all. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just while others are thinking, I love the moment where you described going back to the interviews after many years to transcribe them, and how they conjured up the place and even the smell and the sounds of the interviews. It's, I mean, that's a very evocative image. Tells you something about the power of these interviews.
Yes, they were quite amazing, actually. Elderly people remembering things and having to go back and then go, oh, maybe I've got that wrong, but I can remember. It was really interesting.
Yeah, Claudia, just unmute your audio.
Hi, thanks for the lovely presentation on your book. I just was also interested in the, well, my ears picked up when you mentioned that you had a transcribing machine. And I thought, oh, I've got to get the name of that. And then when I also heard that you actually went back and listened and you transcribed those original interviews, and like Al mentioned, how the moment and all the senses around it came back. I just wondered if you can talk to that, those two ways of transcribing and the pros and cons. Did you do both for each interview?
I don't think I quite understand your question. I'm sorry.
Did you use a machine to transcribe your, or a service to transcribe your interviews, as
Yes.
well as go through them yourself in order to pick up the more nuanced vibe and, you know, that sort of reflection that went along with the actual words spoken?
Because we were a new group, we actually bought our own little machine, and we had a lady that came in to do it, and it was just a local lady that was doing it. So we didn't use a service as such. And we realised that it was just becoming such a problem. I would get it sent to me in South Africa or in England saying, this is as much she can do. All these words are missing. She doesn't know what they mean. So that started to cause an issue. We realised it was just costing too much money. And I'd been trying to avoid all these years me doing all that. I didn't want to learn to type. So suddenly it was, well, you're the only person who understands what's being said. So I then got the job of listening and taking this little machine and going, oh, I can stop and start it. It's a whole new thing for me, you know, all this technology. I'm not a very technological person. That's what Ruth's job is. And Jan's very good at that, but it was the interviews. They were on old tapes, etc. So you had to be there. So as she turned it on, and I'm talking to Myrtle, the First Lady, I had about 6 interviews with her. And the first time I met her, we sat in her lounge room and it was raining. And it was an older house and she had some, just some flowers in the background. And I could just, as I was listening to her talk, I just felt like I'd stepped right back to there. So for me, it was a really personal experience. And I loved going and visiting them all. I still visit old elderly people and collect history. So yeah, just connecting with those people was just a lovely experience. And to think other people were actually interested was even more of a mind-blowing experience.
Just to clarify, I'm assuming this wasn't a machine that actually typed up the transcripts for you. It just played the audio, stopped and started and slowed down. There is no machine that does that, although there are technologies now that voice recognition can do it, but I'm afraid not.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to ask any questions or make any comments about the Cockatoo project? Yeah, Elizabeth. I can't hear you, Elizabeth. No.
Is it Elizabeth? Or?
I've got it off mute.
You're good now. You're good. That's it.
You're
okay. Yep.
Okay. Thank you. As Al said, I was one of the judges, so I was very fortunate to be able to read the book and immersed in the story. So thank you to all of you. You've done an amazing job. And I just wanted to say the thing that struck me too was that you were talking about a tragedy, which was the bushfires. And you did so well to capture that and what it meant to the community. And I think that was an incredible part of the story as well. So I just wanted to thank you for that.
Thank you.
Good.
Margaret, have you got a question?
Yes, look, thank you for that. It was really very, very interesting. I'm wondering whether you're going to be trying to get your book into local schools, because it's, you know, very much the history of people who are living there. And I'm just wondering, you know, what ideas that you have about spreading it, particularly amongst the Cockatoo community.
Ruth, do you want to answer that one? Or Arthur?
Well,
no, they can't hear me.
We've sold 270 copies so far, most of those to the local community or to people who have lived in Cockatoo. We haven't actually thought about sharing with school children yet. So maybe that's a project for the future.
It's just that it's my interest in making sure that the next generation becomes interested in history, because I've got 8 grandchildren and I'm not sure they're getting nearly as much history education as I would like them to have.
We have a local newsletter also, and that newsletter has asked us to do little snippets of the book every month, and so that we can get people interested, and that goes on our Facebook site and things like that too. So
fantastic.
You have an Ash Wednesday bushfire education centre,
right?
Which is very good. That of course has been closed down during the lockdown. That will be reopening very soon, won't it, Ruth? Nods.
Yes. Okay. Look, I think we should probably move on, but congratulations to all of you from from Cockatoo. And as several people said, it was lovely to hear you talk about the project and really bring the process of creating an oral history collection and then turning it into a book, bringing that to life and reminding us how much time and effort and energy and how many difficult, challenging decisions that involves. But I think you've done a tremendous job. Let's move on to the second shortlisted project. This is Jessica Ferrari from Memento Media, whose project was Memories of the Women's Royal Australian Air Force, 1951 to 1977. Jess, would you like to share your screen, and then over to you?
Sure. Is everybody seeing that?
Yes, that's
now?
Good, Jess.
Great.
Good.
Okay. So my project is the Memories of the Women's Royal Australian Air Force, and I'll make a confession. In 2017, when I started the project, I hadn't actually heard of these women, and I didn't know they existed. But being a small business trying to earn a living off history, I'm always on the lookout for grants. And I came across the Community Heritage Icon Grant, and that's a grant, a federal government grant, and it was geared towards projects to do with heritage listed icons. So I did a bit of digging around, and I found the Point Cook Air Base was a heritage listed icon. And then from there, I found that there were some women that were operating there in a women's only air force, the Women's Royal Australian Air Force. They were operating between 1951 and 77. And so I thought, oh, this sounds interesting. And part of the grant did say collecting stories. And I was like, oh, that's oral history. We can wing that. And so I spoke to the RAF, the Royal Australian Air Force, and their head historian gave me a letter of support. And I also contacted the ex-WAF women. They're a really strong community, and they were really excited about the project. So I was really lucky to get the grant. And so now I had the bucket of money, which wasn't heaps of money, but it was some money. And so it's always nice to get some money to do your craft. And the first step was actually just getting approval from the Air Force. So because Point Cook Air Base is still actually an active base, it was quite difficult and time consuming. It took about 8 months. And it wasn't because they weren't trying to help out. It's just so many layers of approval and so many hoops to sort of jump through, and things like you had to get 20 million public liability insurance and things like that. But yeah, eventually I did get approval. But when I kind of went to the archives, it was like the cupboard was bare. So it kind of explained why I hadn't heard much about these women before, because the Air Force's archives themselves didn't really have much material at all. And the heritage listed base itself didn't actually have any structures that related to the women. So I was like, oh dear, this is going to make padding out the oral history component of my project a little bit difficult. But I sort of charged on and I met the women to sort of source my narrators at an RSL. They quite an active community, and they meet regularly at the RSL. And as I met them, as always a documentary maker, I took my camera along just to film a bit of overlay vision of them having lunch and getting together, because I assumed camaraderie was going to be part of the narrative. And the president of the ex-WAF commandeered me and got me to go around every woman in the room and film them listing her number, her rank, how long she served and where she served. And as a documentary maker, I knew that material was kind of worthless. Like, there's no way you can craft that into an interesting narrative. But what really struck me about it was how important it was for these women to exist and to be seen and to be heard. So that kind of was a bit of a challenge, because there's so many women all across Australia who've served in the Air Force, but because of the grant with linked to the heritage listed icon, I had to only interview women who trained or had an involvement with Point Cook. So that was kind of a challenge. It was and also I felt a little bit like the reason it took me so long to complete the project, I think, is I really wanted to do it justice, and I really wanted to do right by these women. And they did right by me. So even though the Air Force didn't have many materials in terms of artifacts, the women themselves had heaps. Like, a lot of them, it was a really golden time in their lives. They had photographs, they had newspaper clippings, they had documents. And one of them even had an old training video, which was really fantastic, because it allowed me to, you know, as a documentary maker, you're always looking for footage to break up the talking heads because they get a bit dull, but also to do that lovely thing that oral history can do, which is kind of change the frame around the official language or official narrative versus the lived experience. And so that's kind of captured in this video about, anyway, I'll let it play and you can see if you see.
And then every Friday we used to get injections. And then we would go and play ball sports.
Back in those days, we all lined up and they used the one syringe. All they did was disinfect the needle. So by the time you got down to the end, it was as blunt as all get out, and one of the girls passed out.
They make their way to the medical section, where inoculations offer no fear to them.
I think it was typhoid. I got on the bus, sitting next to a gorgeous bloke, and just broke down into tears, cried all the way home on the train.
And so that's sort of, you know, there's the official line saying it offered them no fear, and then there's the women in real life saying, actually, we hated it. And it also allowed me to get the women's side of things, so, and kind of disrupt the narrative that being in the Air Force is all about wearing aviator studies and feeling the need for speed. It was able to kind of get the women's experience of not just the Air Force, but also the sort of the life and times as well.
From a monetary point of view, the pay envelope for an airwoman goes a lot further than that of her counterpart in civilian life when such extra benefits are taken into consideration.
We were paid fortnightly, and it was, I think it was £11 a fortnight. So around about $20 a fortnight. But you had, we paid £1 out of that was for our board and food. But other than that, it was money clear. Yeah, the money was pretty good.
Oh no, nothing like the men's wage. Good heavens, we were women. I think we only got about 66% or something compared with the males. And when payday came, you had to arrive in full uniform and salute the pay officer and get your pay in cash, and that was to last you for the 2 weeks. And you didn't have much left over, really, by the time you dressed yourself accordingly, you know, to your, you know, because you had to look nice in civvies as well as in uniform. And I bought myself a car.
And so it's also
what the girls have found when they march.
Not yet. What it also allowed me to kind of get insight in is to the women's experience within the force. And I think the fact that the women had all left the force long ago kind of gave them some freedom to talk about it really candidly. Yeah, so this is sort of how they were experienced within their military peers.
A lot of the girls have found when they march and they wear their medals on the left side, a lot of the men, a lot of people say to me, we're not allowed to wear medals on that side, because they don't acknowledge that the women have been in the services, but they are allowed to wear that medal on their left side.
Recognition, because, for instance, we started marching with the AAAs, the WAF, but we were non-entities in it because most of them had uniforms that they wore, blazers, whatever, and we were forgotten. So we decided we'd march in our place, which was between the Korean and the Vietnam people. The Koreans weren't all that happy. The Vietnamese weren't all that happy about us marching because we weren't veterans. But the point is we were there. As I said, we signed the exact same papers that the men did. It wasn't our fault that we weren't posted to war places. And anyway, I had a bloke from Anzac House tell me one day we had no right to actually march. I said, are you telling us we can't march? And there was dead silence. I said, are you telling us we cannot march?
Yes. So, so then the next sort of question is, or part to the project is, I released it on Anzac Day, and it seemed to really strike a chord with the public. We got thousands of views and engagements, and another sort of good indicator is when somebody likes something enough to share it. You know, that's a sign that they've watched it and they really enjoyed it. And we got a bunch of shares as well. So in total on social media, we got over 20,000 engagements. But for me, the most important audience were those women in the RSL, and you know, those women and the hundreds around Australia who had also served in the Air Force. And sort of what I wanted to know was that I'd done their story justice, and did they now feel seen and heard, and was it an accurate representation? And so looking at their comments on social media, it seems like, you know, that I did sort of achieve my mission in that regard. And obviously, you know, the central part to what we do in history and what we do in oral history is around preservation. So for me, it was a real privilege to capture these amazing women's stories, and so that they can take their place in history. And the Air Force motto, I'm going to butcher the Latin, but is per ardua ad astra, and it means through hardship to the stars. And so I think what this project did was help these women and their memories take flight, so they can join their place among the stars. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Jess. It's lovely. It was a lovely project to watch and to look at the website and all the interviews. And it was also lovely to hear you talk about it as well. So again, we've got 5 minutes or so for any questions that anyone would like to ask, or any comments that anyone would like to ask of Jess about the project. Yeah, Dot.
I'd really like to commend you. I think that's really something that opens things up. For so long, we have looked at what men do, and that's not having a go at men, but women in a lot of areas have been forgotten. So those women would have felt for all those years that no one really heard them or recognised that they were there, and you being able to bring that out has opened up doors that they probably thought were closed a long time ago. So thank you very much for sharing it.
Well, thank you.
Just while you're thinking, can I ask, Jess, I mean, you're obviously doing this project in connection with the Air Force. Did you feel like there were some stories that you couldn't include, or some parts of the experience that you couldn't include?
I was worried about that when the project first, when I was having trouble getting approval, and I do think one of the women was an officer, and I think she did hold back with some material, and her daughter's still sort of involved in the Air Force. So I think there was a little bit kind of self-censorship, but most of the women were fairly open, and I was concerned about the Air Force, but given that I didn't end up actually using any of their materials because they didn't really have many, I didn't need to get their approval. So I had the women sign off on it, and so from a perspective of ethics, I'd kind of covered my bases there. But the Air Force were actually really supportive with the material that came out.
Great, thanks. Anybody else? Any other questions or comments? Yeah, Nicolette.
Hi, Jessica.
Hi.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I really enjoyed it. And what I'm wanting to know is, personally, when you watch Anzac Day, has it challenged the way that you think about Anzac Day, having done this project?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, this year there wasn't a march, but it absolutely sort of hearing sort of this underside to a day where it's about honour and recognition and celebration, but then to feel like there's sort of an in-group and an out-group kind of was a little bit upsetting. And one of the other women talked about that too, sort of initially with the Vietnam vets, they sort of experienced a bit of, they were ostracised as well. So it kind of is a painful part of it, but I think it's an important part of it. And what was really beautiful this year was sharing it on Anzac Day, and having only positive comments and having people share it and saying, you know, thank you for your service, we really appreciate it. So framing them sort of as heroes who've made a contribution, I think really helped.
Anyone else? Okay, I can't see any other hands. Look, Alice, did you want to ask something?
I just had a quick one, which was whether there's been a call from women from other parts of Australia for their story to be told, or whether they feel that it's already been captured by the story, the local story.
No, absolutely. They're actually, before the RAF, the Royal Air Force, there were the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, and they actually went and did service and were much more involved in things. And they've sort of, off the back of my promotion, they've kind of said, hey, what about us? And so I'm like, yeah, I see you. I'm just trying to get another grant. And I imagine there would be among many other armed forces as well. Like, I don't have a military background, but, you know, sort of once you open it up, I think there's a space for all sorts of different narratives to come out of this.
That's great, Jess. It sounds like you could work your way through all the different women's services. I think, Claudia, did you have a question? You're muted. You just need to unmute.
Thanks, Jess. That was really interesting. I had a bit of a look at it on the OHV website, but great to see the snapshots again. Was just curious to know, in terms of your interview with the women, over what period of time you spoke to them, and did you do several interviews, or did you capture it in like one-offs and edit from there?
No, I did 2 interviews with each of the women, just because, you know, it's after you've left that they call you and say, oh, I forgot about another whole thing. So I did significant research before, met the women at the RSL and did that sort of background work to make them feel comfortable. And because when you're working with video as a medium, you really do need to have a real kind of capacity to make them feel at ease, because it is very sort of difficult to manufacture a comfortable environment with a camera and a light and, you know, a microphone and all of that kind of stuff. So I did spend a fair bit of time with the women before I conducted the interviews, and then each of the women I did 2, so like 45 minutes about interviews, and as well, because a lot of them are sort of moving on. One of them's living with cancer, so also I didn't want to tire them out. But yeah, so it was probably over a period of, would have been 6 months, 8 months, between sort of initial contact and then conducting the research and the interviews. And yeah.
Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks, Jess. It's a wonderful project, and I'd urge you all to go and have a look at the website. We should move on to our third commended nomination for this award. And this is, I'll hold it up because they're not going to do a slideshow. This is Sandy Jeffs and Margaret Leggatt's wonderful book, Out of the Madhouse, From Asylums to Caring Community. So I'll pass it over to Sandy and Margaret now. Over to you.
Thanks, Alistair. What fabulous projects the other projects are. I really am in awe of what you've all done. Our project began a long time ago. It began with my admissions to Larundel Psychiatric Hospital as a patient. I had 7 admissions there between 1978 and 1991. And you can't be in a place like Larundel and not be affected by it. It affects your very soul, the very core of who you are. And I lived with my Larundel experiences for a long time. And some friends of mine suggested in 2011, they said to me, why don't you write a book about Larundel? And my initial thought was to write a history of Larundel. But I soon realised I'm not a historian at all. Even though I have a university degree, I'm not a historian. But I thought, I want to write a narrative of Larundel that has front and centre the voices of the people who are actually there, either as inmates or as staff. And I say this because I think oral history is so important, because I've read a lot of books about madness, a lot of textbooks and a lot of intellectual meditations on madness, but not many, if any, actually go to the source of the madhouses, like the patients and the staff. So that was my imperative, to have front and centre the voice of the people who were there. And also, as I would drive down Plenty Road past Larundel, I would see it in its ruinous state. It was disintegrating before our very eyes. Buildings have been bulldozed. The gardens, the once beautiful gardens, are now trashed and gone. And there's a big building left. The big two-storey building is left that sits in ruins. And I saw Larundel fading away from us. It was fading away from our consciousness and fading away from the mental health world. And I wanted to remind people that Larundel actually existed and that it had some merit in what it did. For some people, it angered them and politicised them and broke them as people. For other people, it was a source of asylum and healing, depending on what your experience of the place was. So what I decided to do was to interview people. So I did the first interview in 2011. So it's a 10-year project. From conception to reality, it was 10 years. And I just kept interviewing people. And I sourced my interviewees through word of mouth, recommendations, or people I knew, who I had known myself. And I just sat with them and asked questions and really interrogated their experience. And what I found was that the nurses were very expansive about their experiences of Larundel. They had a fabulous time at Larundel. It was all about camaraderie, about learning experiences, about progressing their careers. For the patients, and I call them in the book, I call them inmates because it's I use it willingly because it was a total institution where you were totally involved if you were a patient. You were there not for days, but for weeks and months. So I call them inmates. For them, their recollections were more torturous and much more painful. And really, I'm very, very mindful how gracious they were to sit with me and tell me their stories of Larundel, tell me their war stories, basically, of Larundel. And it was really instructive for me to hear these stories because my experience was rather benign. I only had one bad experience there. Otherwise, my experience was of good nursing and a fairly healing place. It was asylum for me. For other people, they had much more traumatic experiences, and for them, it was hard to recollect and to tell their stories. But it was very gracious of them to do it. And so in the end, I think I interviewed about 71 people face to face. And so, and that was over a period from about 2011 to 2016. So I had a mounting toll of transcripts there. It was getting out of hand. It was just overwhelming me. And I was trying to do transcripts, and I had a digital program that someone had given me where I could use the computer to stop and start the program. But with 71 interviews, some of which were over 2 hours long, it was just a mountain I couldn't climb. And I thought, oh, golly, I'm going to drown in this project. I can't do it. But it was one that I was passionate about because I just wanted to reinvigorate Larundel in people's minds. It had to be not lost to history because there's so much wisdom from the place and so much that we can learn from Larundel, particularly in the mental health system now, which we do critique in our book. You know, if we don't look back and see what we had, then we have no context for creating a new system, which is rather tragic because the system we have hasn't looked back well enough. So I had this mountain of material. I had this desire to write this book, and I thought, what can I do? How can I progress this project? I thought, okay, I'll phone a friend. So I phoned Margie Leggatt, my dear friend who I've known since 1978 or 9. We together have been pushing the mental health barrow, trying to destigmatise schizophrenia, which is the illness that I live with. And I thought Margie would be a great co-author because she has a wealth of mental health experience, a wealth of advocacy, and she's smart. She's Dr. Margaret Leggatt, so she must have creds to be able to do this. So I called Margie. I said, Margie, I know you're wanting to get out of mental health and have a normal life, but do you want to be my co-author? And Margie very graciously said yes, she'd come on board. So I really appreciate the fact that she did that. Having interviewed all these people, it's actually tragic because I know at least 8 of them have died since I interviewed them, which is really, it's interesting in itself. And And so I'm glad I've captured their recollections before they passed away, because they're so invaluable to have this story of Larundel. So I think at this stage, I'll hand over to Margie, who will talk about her part in the project and why she answered the phone.
Well, I answered the phone, and as you know, Sandy, yes, I'm unmuted, am I? Yes, okay. I can never, ever refuse you. But I must admit that when you asked me to help you, I thought, oh my goodness me, I am not an historian, and I am also not a writer. So I thought, Anyway, I was very concerned that if you didn't get some help, that this book wouldn't be written. And I believe very, very strongly in your project. So the very first thing we had to do, and I was very interested in the first person who was talking about the business of transcription. I've never transcribed anything, I don't think. So all of a sudden, the first problem was 71 interviews, 2.5 hours long. How on earth are we going to do anything about that? So we looked around and we found some money, and we found a person who was used to doing some transcriptions. So the three of us got down, and in the end, I can't remember how long it took us, Sandy. It was quite some time, wasn't it, before we had all of the interviews transcribed. And then we had this mountain of material. How on earth are we going to develop? Sorry.
It took about 2 years. It took about 2 years to get them transcribed, I think.
Was it about 2 years? Okay. So then we had all this material, and you and I looked at each other and thought, well, what on earth are we going to do with it? And then it sort of became quite clear that you, as you call yourself, an inmate, and those of you who do get round to reading our book will know that Sandy and I, over the years, have had very, very different perspectives on things. And one of the things that we've got different perspectives on is the use of language. So when Sandy said she thought, well, when we get all these transcriptions done, we're going to call it Out of the Madhouse. And I said, no, I don't want it called Madhouse, because Larundel was developing at a time when we were trying to change the language. We didn't want to talk about madhouses. We wanted to talk about hospitals, that people who were mad, as Sandy keeps on calling herself mad. I don't like her calling herself mad, because to me she isn't. She has periods when she's unwell. So we were changing the language from madhouse to hospital, and from loony mad person to person with a psychiatric illness. So Sandy and I have had marvellous discussions about all of this. Eventually you might notice it's Sandy who wins the arguments, but I've got used to that. Anyway, we had all this material, and I said to Sandy, well, you were an inmate, and inmates spent most of their time with the nurses. It was the inmates, and the nurses were with the patients 24/7. And then there were people like me. I mean, I originally trained as an occupational therapist and had worked in psychiatric hospitals. So there were the allied health professionals, the psychiatrists, the psychologists, the OTs, the social workers. And of course, at Larundel, there were the most magnificent group of men, the chaplains. So I said to Sandy, okay, I'll write up all of the allied health professional side of things. You write up the what the patients, consumers, inmates said, and what the nurses said. So that's how we actually divided the book up, and that's how we actually wrote it. And then after we had done all that, it became very clear to us that the big question that we asked, and the book, what the book is really all about, what have we gained and what have we lost by closing the big mental hospitals? And I think the last 2 chapters of the book really rather deal with that, because what Sandy and I came to the conclusion very, very quickly was that the really good things that happened at Larundel the things that we are neglecting in our present day mental health services. The fact that at Larundel people had very organised lives. They were involved in the occupational therapy department. They were redeveloping the social skills that they had lost as a consequence of their mental illness. So that really is the very big question that the book asks. Sandy, do you want to add to that? You've gone off.
Yes, we do ask those important questions, and I think what people have responded to in our book is the humanity of it. That it's a very humane book, looking in a very humane way at difficult problems. That we don't shy away from the fact that mental illness is a minefield to treat and to deal with, and that through the narrative that we've constructed in our book is a very humane thing rolling all the way through it, that we want better outcomes for people who are suffering with their terrible illnesses, and that how can we best do that. And that we looked at Larundel, and we saw Larundel during the 70s, which we call the golden age of Larundel, where there was a therapeutic community called Faulkner House, which revolved all around group therapy and personal therapy and personal development with no use of medication. And it was a very, very highly sought after ward in the hospital by both staff and by the patients. And it was seen as one of the apexes of Larundel in its history. So we look at treating paradigms, and really the book looks at the changing and evolution of psychiatric services and psychiatric treatments over the years too, beginning back with the insulin coma of the 1950s to the medications we have now, and looking at the medications we've gone through and that I've gone through personally as a way of seeing how psychiatric services have developed or not developed, whatever you want to call it. So I think so. The book is really it asks those important questions, and it probably I don't think it answers them actually, but it tries to offer something humane as a way forward. I hope.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Look, thank you both. It's a terrific book. I think all of it. I mean, the concluding quote from the judge's commendation was, "This is a book of invaluable wisdom for our troubled times," and we just thought it was terrific. So look, we've got 5 minutes or so for any questions or comments from anybody out there. I'm just looking up to see. Anybody want to ask? Yeah, Jess, you just need to unmute.
Yeah, I'm curious, Sandy, how did you keep momentum? Like, that's a huge undertaking, from 2011 to 2016, like, especially because I imagine some of what you were hearing might have been quite difficult narratives. So I'm just curious, how did you keep momentum? It's amazing.
Don't know. Well, I don't know. Maybe I'm determined, and I didn't want Larundel to be forgotten, and that was my whole paradigm. I mean, I think we should be erecting a monument on the site to commemorate all who passed through Larundel. It should be, and staff and inmates. But I kept going because I had this passion to keep Larundel alive in people's consciousnesses, and also when I brought Margie on board, that really helped to keep me going, and we kept each other going. So the 10-year project that it turned out to be was a long time, but I'm so glad that we kept at it and that we didn't lose momentum. I think we spurred each other on. We also had help from Jackie Yao, who was our editor, who was a great person as a sounding board, as someone who was great at looking at our text and seeing how we could improve it and restructuring it. Bruce Sims also did a restructure for us. So we had help along the way that kept us going. And I think that without that help, without each other and the help we got, it may have floundered. But also, I think I'm just bloody minded.
Thanks. Anybody else? Alicia?
I just wanted to say to two people who say you're not a writer or not a historian, although I think, Sandy, you've done quite a bit of writing beyond this book.
I wrote a memoir.
Yeah.
I'm a poet more than anything else. I'm actually a poet first and a writer second.
Well, to both of you, I couldn't stop reading it. I couldn't put it down. I'd go for walks in between home learning at my house and working. and I'd sort of walk with the book. I commend it to everyone if you haven't read it, because it really integrates oral history into the story so beautifully. It flows really well, and again, the voices of the people come to the fore. I think you did such a great job. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. When I was writing it, though, I kept thinking to myself, I'm writing a really bad first-year university essay here. And it's not going to go any further. I was really worried about what I was doing, because I thought, oh, God, I can't do this. But
I can tell you, Sandy, I wish I read first-year university essays like that one.
No, people have commented on how nicely it's written, which is really heartening for us, because, you know, we're just amateurs at this.
Also, the testament, the interviews that you, the book is full of quotes and from the interviews. They're both poetic and insightful and moving and powerful. So it's the combination of your structure and your prose, but also their stories and their words. It's a very powerful combination.
Oh, their words are fantastic, and they were so I don't know. It must have been the questions or something, but they were such great retelling of the stories, great recollections that they gave. They were so colourful and so incisive and insightful. It was really, I think it's testament to them as well, and how they came on board when I was sat there and interrogated them. They really were gracious in how they responded and gave me the information.
I do wonder how much it's you as the interviewer as well, Sandy, you know, that you're coming from a shared experience. And how that influenced the answers people were able to give to you specifically.
Well, I think having my own experience of Larundel, I knew what to ask sometimes, and I knew where I could go with the questioning. So I think my experience and my recollections, my own recollections, helped to structure the interviews, and particularly the former inmates, to have empathy with them and to be able to share stuff that they might not share with someone else if they were being asked questions.
Anybody else? Alice? Yeah, Alice, you.
Yeah, I was just curious. I've got lots of questions actually, but the one I'll ask is, how did you find the people you interviewed, particularly the patients or inmates? Because I'm assuming that you wouldn't have had records, or was it snowball? Sort of one person would recommend someone else.
It was people I knew, but also recommendations and people putting me on to somebody else. So it was by word of mouth. It got out there, word of mouth, and some organisations helped me, like Nemi, who are situated in Heidelberg. They put me onto some people in their art studio, at the Splash Art Studio. So it was really word of mouth and just seeking out. And I don't know. It's funny because it's such a long time ago. I sort of forgotten how it all happened, but it was just finding people, and I just ring up and say, hello, this is my project, would you mind if I interviewed you? And they were very gracious about it.
Actually, on that note, because I was thinking about how even interviewing for something that's much less about perhaps sort of, you know, intensely personal experiences, I still feel nervous before I go into an interview, before I interview someone. And I'm just wondering how you felt before you went into an interview with someone who was potentially going to be talking about really sensitive and difficult stuff.
Oh, nervous, but hoping that I would honour them, that whatever they told me, I would honour it appropriately in the text and however I used it. They did all sign a permission form too, that to say that I could use their names or not use their names and be anonymous. And most of them said they didn't mind me using their real names. There were some who wanted to remain anonymous. I think that's interesting in itself, because stigma is alive and well in mental health. And being in Larundel for some people isn't the most positive time of their life or the best time of their life. And some people didn't want their name to be used because they were acutely aware of the stigma that Larundel still held in the community and their association with it. So that was in itself interesting too.
Look, Sandy, you mentioned the business of stigma, and I think that you and I hope that the book could go a long way to doing something about lessening the stigma. certainly for the inmates, but also for the staff. Because let's go back to Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and the absolutely atrocious nurse Ratched. Now, I think the interviews with the staff, the psychiatrists and the nurses really shows that the people who were working at Larundel were incredibly humane. They weren't nurse Ratcheds. And I think also the psychiatrists, I hope that in a way those interviews in our book will show that the psychiatrists there were very, very caring people coping with very, very difficult situations. Yeah. I mean, we talk a lot about the new medications that had been discovered and the absolutely hideous side effects. And the fact that the staff there knew that their treatments were inadequate. They weren't the best treatments yet, and lots of you suffered terribly from side effects and so on. But I'm hoping that the staff, because people who work in mental health facilities often feel equally as stigmatised as the patients. Would you agree?
Well, that's a really good point, Margaret. Look, we're probably going to have to round it up now because I'm afraid we have an AGM to move on to. But I just wanted to conclude this section, start off by thanking Margaret and Sandy for what is a terrific book. Let me hold it up again and urge you all to get hold of it and read it. Like Alicia, I could not stop reading this book. And some of you will know that there was a YouTube video yesterday where they, for the first time, they announced the Victorian Community History Awards through this video, which is available on the Oral History Victorian website, so you can see the whole 30-odd minute event. I think the oral history bit is about 25 minutes in, so if you want to fast forward, you can find it. Look, all three, as you can see, were wonderful projects, really worthy, terrific material, terrific productions, very different. But we had to choose one winner, which is always difficult. And I can tell you that Out of the Madhouse was the winner of the 2020 Oral History Award, and due credit